All right, so you know how it is you're interested in history, right?
Yeah.
And you want to like really get a handle on all those forces that shape the world, but you don't want to wade through like tons of academic papers and stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Today we're diving deep into a period that seems kind of familiar at first glance.
Yeah,
You know, the whole Queen Victoria thing and her massive empire.
right.
You probably have a picture in your head already, like Victorian era, peak
Yeah.
British power, Queen Victoria, this like really imposing figure, Empress of India, all that.
Oh, absolutely. And for a lot of people, that image is totally tied to this idea of like progress and British influence, being just everywhere.
Right, exactly.
Unparalleled.
Yeah, but the real juicy stuff you really want to know
Yeah.
is like what was going on under the surface, behind that carefully crafted image,
Yeah.
because you're not here for the like basic textbook version.
No, no, no.
So our mission in this deep dive, and we're using all the source material you sent us, by
Yeah.
the way,
Yes.
is to uncover those less obvious motivations, the real consequences of this like crazy, powerful empire.
Yeah.
We're going way beyond the simple story of like, oh, it was all benevolent progress.
Right.
To really get to dig into those driving forces for you.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at the political ambition, the real economic interests that made the empire expand, and that whole drive for like global domination that was at the heart of Queen Victoria's empire.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking this idea of benevolent imperialism,
Okay.
because that's often the first thing people think of, right?
Yeah.
Like British Empire was this force for good, bringing civilization to like all these different parts of the world.
It's a really strong image and it's stuck around, but think about what else was going on at the time.
Right.
You have the Industrial Revolution happening in Britain, and there's this huge global competition for resources, for power. And suddenly you start to see a different picture emerging.
Yeah.
The empire expanding, it wasn't all about, altruism.
Right.
It was tied up with Britain's economic needs and wanting to be top dog globally.
So not just like sharing afternoon tea out of the goodness of their hearts then.
Not quite.
So where do we see this economic exploitation playing out in really concrete ways?
Well, let's look at the Opium Wars in China, for example.
Oh, yeah, the Opium Wars. Not exactly benevolent.
No, not really.
Tell me how that all went down.
Okay, so what you really got to understand here is Britain's involvement in the opium trade.
Okay.
This was big business for them.
Right.
They grew opium in India, and then British merchants, with the government's full backing, they basically flooded China with this stuff.
Wow.
Which is highly addictive, as you know.
Yeah.
And the impact on Chinese society was devastating.
Right.
Huge addiction problems, major social problems all over.
And I imagine China was not thrilled about this situation.
Oh, they were not happy at all, and they tried to put a stop to it.
Of course.
But when the Chinese government took steps to stop the opium trade, Britain responded with military force.
Wow. So they went to war over this.
Yeah, we're talking about the Opium Wars. The first one, 1839 to 1842, and then again, 1856 to 1860. And the results of these wars, they really show you what Britain's agenda was.
Yeah.
They forced China to sign treaties. The big one was the Treaty of Nanking in 1842.
Okay.
And that treaty, it made China give Hong Kong to Britain.
Wow.
Plus, it opened up a bunch of Chinese ports to British merchants.
Right. So they could keep selling opium.
Exactly. And all sorts of other British goods, too.
So much for spreading goodwill, right?
Yeah, it was all about opening up markets for themselves by force.
And making a profit, even if it meant getting a whole nation hooked on drugs.
Yeah, you see that a lot, economic interests winning out over any kind of moral high ground.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the Indian Rebellion of 1857.
Okay.
Now, a lot of people see that as like a sudden uprising.
Right.
But it sounds like you're saying it was more complicated than that.
Way more complicated.
Yeah.
This wasn't some isolated event.
Okay.
It was a direct result of how the British East India Company had been exploiting India for years.
Okay, so how are they doing that?
Think about it. They took over huge chunks of land, imposed these crazy high taxes that basically destroyed local economies, and they were just siphoning off India's wealth to make themselves richer.
So all the stuff about disrespecting religious beliefs, that was more like the final straw.
Yeah, that was the trigger.
Right.
The rumors about the greased cartridges for the new rifles,
Yeah.
the ones that supposedly used cow and pig fat, that was a huge problem for both Hindus and Muslims.
Yeah, makes sense.
But the real cause was decades of economic exploitation and having no political power under the East India Company.
And then when the rebellion happened, the British crack down hard.
Brutally,
Yeah.
which really makes you think about Queen Victoria and her whole image as this like benevolent ruler of India.
Right.
It's clear that keeping control of this super profitable colony was the top priority no matter how many people had to die.
So a very different picture from the one you usually get.
Definitely.
Okay, let's move on to Africa now and this so-called scramble for Africa.
Okay.
That was a crazy period of expansion, right?
Yeah, in the late 1800s, you see Queen Victoria's empire, along with all the other European powers going at it, trying to carve up Africa among themselves. And again, they talk about it as this civilizing mission, bringing progress and all that.
Right.
But the real reasons were much more selfish.
Like what?
Well, we've seen how economic forces drove what Britain did in Asia.
Yeah.
It was the same story in Africa.
So taking all the resources they could get their hands on.
Exactly. They wanted Africa's minerals, rubber, all the good stuff.
Okay.
Plus, they wanted strategic military bases.
Right.
And they just wanted to be in charge.
It's basically more of the same.
Pretty much.
Okay, so let's talk about some specific examples.
Right.
What about the Boer War? That was always a bit of a mess, wasn't it?
The Boer War, yeah, that was a rough one.
Yeah, what was the deal with that?
The key thing to understand there is what started it.
Okay.
They found a ton of gold and diamonds in the Transvaal,
Okay.
which was controlled by the Boer republics.
Who were the Boers again?
They were settlers of Dutch origin.
Oh, right.
Anyway, the British government, they wanted all that gold and diamonds for themselves.
So they went to war over it.
Yep. The Boer War lasted from 1899 to 1902, and it caused a ton of damage, especially for the Boer civilians.
Oh, wow.
The British Army, they used scorched earth tactics, and they set up concentration camps where tons of Boer women and children suffered terribly.
That's awful.
It's a reminder of how far people will go for money and power,
Yeah, definitely.
How they can be so cruel.
Okay, and then there's the Congo Free State.
Right.
Now, you said that wasn't directly under Queen Victoria,
No, it wasn't.
but it's still important to talk about, right?
It is because it shows you the bigger picture of what colonialism was all about.
Okay.
So the Congo Free State was controlled by King Leopold II of Belgium,
Right.
and it became famous for how badly they exploited the rubber there.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about this.
Millions of Congolese people were killed or mutilated. They were forced to harvest rubber.
It was like slavery.
Basically, and Britain eventually criticized Leopold, but you got to remember they were doing the same kind of stuff in other parts of Africa.
Taking resources, exploiting people.
Exactly. It's just that Leopold was particularly brutal about it.
Yeah.
So it makes you think, were they really against exploitation, or were they just mad that someone else was getting all the profits?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to this idea of suppressing rebellions in indigenous cultures.
Okay.
It sounds like that was a big part of how British imperialism worked.
Oh, definitely. As they spread their power around the world, they constantly ignored the people and cultures that were already there.
Right.
The colonies were just seen as sources of stuff and markets for British goods.
Not as places with their own history and culture and ways of governing themselves?
Exactly. And that led to some really terrible treatment of indigenous populations.
Like in Australia with the stolen generations.
Yeah, for a big chunk of Queen Victoria's reign, Australia was basically a giant prison colony. And the Aboriginal people, they were pushed off their land, they got sick from European diseases, they were killed.
And then the stolen generations.
That was even worse. The government took Aboriginal children away from their families.
Why would they do that?
They wanted to force them to assimilate, become more like white Australians.
That's so messed up.
It was, and the effects of that policy are still felt today.
Wow.
It's a really dark part of Australian history.
Okay. And then there were the Maori Wars in New Zealand?
Yeah, the Maori people, they fought hard against the British, trying to take over their land.
Yeah.
Even though there were treaties, Queen Victoria's government always sided with the British settlers.
So more war.
Yeah, a lot of fighting, a lot of people died, and in the end, the Maoris were pushed off their land and the British took control.
It's like the same story everywhere, isn't it?
It is pretty much.
The British come in, take what they want, and ignore the people who are already there.
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate summary.
It seems like the whole thing was driven by the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, absolutely. British industry needed resources and markets, and the colonies provided both.
Sometimes in really brutal ways.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay, so let's talk more about forced labor and exploitation.
Okay.
We mentioned the abolition of the slave trade, but it sounds like other forms of exploitation continued.
Yeah, it's important to remember that while Britain did abolish the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, they still needed cheap labor to produce all the raw materials for their industries.
Like cotton and sugar and rubber.
Exactly. And so in places like India, Africa, the Caribbean, they used other systems of forced labor.
So basically slavery by another name.
Pretty much. And you can't forget about Britain's role in the global slave trade before it was abolished. They built a lot of their wealth on the backs of enslaved people.
And then there was indentured servitude.
Right. That was especially common in India.
How did that work?
After slavery was abolished, they needed a new way to get cheap labor.
Right.
So they started recruiting Indian laborers to work on plantations all over the empire. Millions of them were sent to places like the Caribbean, Africa, Southeast Asia.
And were they treated well?
No, not at all. They worked in terrible conditions for long hours and barely got paid.
So not much better than slavery.
No, not really. It was just another way to exploit people for profit.
So we've talked about the economic side of things.
Yeah.
But what about the ideology? You know, the ideas that people use to justify all of this.
Well, that's where the white man's burden comes in.
Yes, the white man's burden doesn't sound so great from our perspective today.
Yeah, it was a pretty messed up idea.
So what was it all about?
It was basically this idea that white people had a duty to civilize the rest of the world.
Civilize.
Yeah, bring them Christianity, Western education, European culture, all that.
So it's like they were doing everyone a favor.
Exactly. They were the heroes bringing enlightenment to the poor, ignorant savages.
And of course, this was all tied up with ideas about racial superiority.
Oh, absolutely. They believed that white people were just naturally better than everyone else.
And that somehow justified conquering and exploiting them.
Yeah, it's crazy when you think about it.
It really is. And then you had social Darwinism, which tried to make it all sound scientific.
Right. They took Darwin's ideas about evolution and twisted them to say that some races were more evolved than others.
So the British were at the top of the evolutionary ladder.
Obviously.
And everyone else was below them.
Yeah, it was all very convenient for them.
Yeah.
It gave them a reason to do whatever they wanted.
So basically, they created this whole system of beliefs to make themselves feel better about what they were doing.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's bring it back to Queen Victoria for a minute.
Okay.
What about her role in all this, especially the opium trade?
That's a good question because it really challenges that image of her as this virtuous queen.
Right.
The British government was heavily involved in the opium trade.
Yeah.
And she was the head of the government.
So she must have known what was going on.
Oh, she definitely knew. And the profits from the opium trade were huge.
So she was basically profiting from drug addiction.
Yeah. It's pretty dark when you think about it.
It really is. Okay, so last question.
Okay.
What's the legacy of all this? How does this history affect the world today?
That's a really important question.
Yeah.
Because the effects of colonialism are still felt all over the world.
Like how?
Well, for one thing, think about national borders.
Okay.
A lot of those borders were drawn by European powers during the colonial era.
And they didn't care about the people who actually lived there.
Oh, no, they just drew lines on a map.
And that caused a lot of problems.
Huge problems. It led to conflicts and instability in a lot of places.
Right.
And then there's the economic inequality.
Between former colonies and the countries that colonized them.
Exactly. Centuries of exploitation left a lot of those countries poor and underdeveloped.
So basically, the effects of colonialism are still with us today.
Oh, yeah,
And
definitely.
it makes you think about whose stories we tell about history.
Right, whose voices are heard and whose are silenced.
So maybe we need to re-examine how we think about this period.
I think we do, because understanding the past is crucial for understanding the present.
Yeah, and for building a better future.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us today. This has been a really insightful conversation.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all of you listening, thanks for tuning in to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
Bye.